Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let me begin with your chart, which shows a reduction in VA disability claims, but in a sense, those claims now have caused an increase in the number of appeals, which demonstrates, in a sense, that you've reduced the numbers but simply shifted the problem. That's an oversimplistic way of putting it, but as a lawyer in the federal courts or state courts for that matter, if a backlog were cleared simply by moving that great mound of work to the appellate process where appeals languish for years and years and years, it would not be regarded as a success story. And so the 440,000 appeals that currently are pending is, in my view, unacceptable.
Well, that's exactly why it's one of our breakthrough objectives. And as we've said, assuming we can work together on the legislation, we are planning to get 90% of appeals resolved within 1 year, and I think we can all sign up for that objective.
And just as a qualification to the point that you just made, many of those veterans are receiving benefits, yes, but they may be nowhere near the amount of benefits that they deserve and need. Yes. So simply to say, well, they're already getting something doesn't mean they're getting everything that they need and deserve.
No, that was a statement of fact. It wasn't any intent to downgrade the importance of getting them what they deserve.
I understand. So let me come to the question that you just raised. Could you give us the details? I assume that you would support the measure that I mentioned earlier that Senator Shaheen, myself, others have supported to expedite those appeals. Are there additional authorities that you need to get this job done?
We will have to overhaul the appeal process. It's really that simple. The law was created at the turn of the century, well, the turn of the previous, well, in the early 1900s.
Of the last century.
Yeah, last century. I'm sorry. Yeah, I used to be able to say that. And so the basis of it is antiquated technology and many other things that are no longer applicable. We have used our process mapping techniques, the Lean Six Sigma I talked about. We have process mapped the process. We think there are steps we can take out, but it will require a change in legislation. You want to say any more, Danny?
Yes, Senator. It'll require a change in legislation, and we're going to have to put some more people at the against the problem too, in order to tackle it.
And my question is specifically what legislative changes are necessary?
I think the legislative changes that we're working with the veteran service organizations right now to close the record, I think if we can get that in place, I think that'll go a long way to solving the problem. I really believe, looking at the figures they've shown us, that we can do veterans' appeals in 1 year. We just have to continue to work with the VSOs to make sure that we're doing that the right way. I haven't had a chance to look at the legislation that's been proposed, the 8-year legislation. That sounds like a great idea to expedite the ones, like that's what we did with the backlog. We did the oldest ones first. Right now they're doing it by docket order. We just got to make sure that that doesn't inadvertently harm a veteran, that's all.
Well, let me make a suggestion to you. I'm just a country lawyer from Connecticut. In Connecticut, in criminal matters, because of the backlog, a rule was adopted that the failure to prosecute within a set amount of time would result in a dismissal, the speedy trial rule. And I think that became law in various forms in the federal system as well. In other words, and don't hold me to the details, but deadlines were set, timelines were established. The failure to proceed within that time frame meant that the government's case, in effect, would be dismissed, and the burden was on the government to prosecute the matter. So at some point, an appeal that is pending for that amount of time within a government structure or process perhaps should result in the government losing the case.
Senator, I would rather work, like the chairman said, on coming up with good legislation and also systemic changes to the way we do our work, rather than just setting a somewhat arbitrary 8-year limit. I mean, I understand the legislation, I understand 8 years, but the legislation doesn't say how you do it. As a business guy, the biggest challenge is always figuring out how you do it. And so I would rather work with you and the chairman to figure out how we do it, and then make sure we put the legislation in place that we need to get it done.
And I'm not advocating arbitrary deadlines. I'm not suggesting that I am supporting this system now, but at some point, if this problem is not alleviated, that kind of approach is going to be necessary. To go back to your days in the private sector, if you could not get products to the shelf, you were penalized. Nobody said, we're going to keep the stores closed until P&G has its products ready to go on the shelves. So there is a burden of proof, so to speak, a burden of going forward, a burden of proceeding, a burden of fulfilling the government's obligation here. I don't want to go on at great length, but what I'm suggesting is that the remedies for delay may well be that the veteran receives what his claim is, because he's the one who's prejudiced. The government isn't. Delay works in the government's favor, just as it did in the criminal context, because very often the criminal defendant was kept without bail, or with bail that couldn't be made, or under the great burden of charges pending. And these kinds of deadlines for proceeding, whether in the civil or criminal context, in the judicial world, may have applicability here. That's what I'm suggesting, and we may not be at that point yet, but we may soon be there.
Well, we've identified it as one of our 12 priorities for the year. Let's work together on it, and hopefully by the end of the year, we'll get to a point where 90% of appeals are resolved in a year.
Thank you.